Aliens mistakenly thought they had no one left, called humanity for help, and a fleet arrived. Part 1. The Last Signal. The Velhari Council Chamber was quiet in a way that felt wrong. It was not the quiet of peace. It was not the quiet of rest. It was the kind of quiet that comes after everything has already been lost, when the shouting is over, and the only thing left is the slow, cold understanding that no one is coming to help. Elder Riva stood at the center of the circular chamber and looked at the star map hovering above the council table. Each star on that map represented a world. Each world had once had a name, a population, a council seat, a voice. Now most of them were marked in red. Red meant fallen. Red meant gone. Red meant the draft swarm had come. And nothing was left behind except wreckage and silence. She counted the red marks slowly, the way someone counts losses they already know by heart, but cannot stop counting anyway. 41 worlds, gone. 6 more were blinking, that pale yellow blink that the system used, when a world had stopped sending regular transmissions, but had not yet been confirmed destroyed. Yellow was somehow worse than red. Red was final. Yellow meant someone out there might still be alive, and screaming into a dead channel where nobody was listening anymore. Counselor Bane stood beside her. He was an old Velhari, older than Riva, with gray skin that had turned even grayer in the past year. He had been on the council for 60 years. He had seen wars before. He had seen the Velhari survive things that should have killed them. But he had never seen anything like the draft swarm, and the look on his face made that very clear. "We have tried everyone," he said. His voice was low. It had lost the careful, formal tone that council members were trained to use. There was no point anymore. The Sereni sent their last fleet 8 months ago. It did not come back. The Chalak signed a surrender agreement with the swarm 6 weeks ago. We have not heard from them since the signing. The Marathi went dark before that. Riva nodded slowly. She already knew all of this. She had been the one to receive each of those reports. She had been the one to update the star map. "Then we are alone," she said. "Yes." Bane paused. "Almost." Riva looked at him. There was something in his voice. Not hope exactly, because hope felt too large and too foolish for this moment, but something smaller than hope. Something like the last ember left in a fire that everyone has given up on. He walked to the far side of the table and pulled up a secondary map. This one was older, a survey map from nearly 2 centuries ago, showing the outer edges of the galaxy, the quiet, unremarkable regions that the major spacefaring civilizations had never paid much attention to. He pointed to a small star. Orbiting it was a single blue and green planet. "Earth," he said. Riva stared at it. "The humans?" "Yes," he said. She said nothing for a moment. She knew of humans, in the vague and distant way that most Velhari knew of them. A young species, barely 300 years into space travel, not yet part of any major alliance, not yet considered important enough to invite to any significant council meeting. They had a few colony worlds. They had some ships. They had a reputation for being stubborn and loud and difficult to deal with in trade negotiations. Beyond that, nobody knew very much about them, because nobody had considered them worth studying closely. "They are not ready for something like this," Riva said. "No one was ready," Bane replied. "The Soreni were ready. The Chalak were ready. They are gone." Riva looked at the blue planet for a long time. Outside the chamber windows, the sky above Velhari Prime was a deep, bruised purple. The atmospheric processors on the northern continent had been damaged in the last swarm raid, and the sky had not been its normal color in 3 weeks. Somewhere below the city, in the underground shelters that had been built years ago as a precaution, and were now full past capacity, 700 million Velhari were waiting to see if the council had found a way out. They had not found a way out. but they had found a door. A small, unlikely, probably useless door. And Riva decided that a small, useless door was better than no door at all. "Prepare a transmission," she said. "Full detail, swarm composition, movement patterns, casualty numbers, everything we have. Encode it in the standard interstellar contact format so their systems can read it." She paused. "And add our coordinates." Bane looked at her carefully. "If the swarm intercepts the signal—" "The swarm already knows where we are," Riva said. "They are not hiding from us. We are hiding from them, and we are not doing it very well." Bane gave a small nod and moved to the communication terminal. The transmission took 40 minutes to prepare. It was enormous. Gigabytes of sensor data, battle recordings, casualty reports, maps of swarm movement across 6 years of war. Riva reviewed it once before it was sent. She read the casualty numbers again. Over 40 billion dead across all the fallen worlds. She read them the same way she counted the red marks on the star map, already knowing them, unable to stop. Then she authorized the transmission and watched it go. The signal left Velhari Prime at the speed of light, carrying with it everything the Council knew about the draft swarm, and a single line added at the very end by Riva herself. Not in the formal language of interstellar diplomacy, but in simple, plain words that she hoped would translate correctly. "We have no one left. If there is anyone listening, please come." She did not expect a reply. Every other species they had called had either not answered or had answered and then failed. The humans were young and small and far away, and almost certainly did not have the resources to make any kind of difference. Riva knew this. She sat back down in her council chair and folded her hands on the table and told herself she had simply done the last thing available to do. She told herself this was not hope. It was procedure. It was thoroughness. It was making sure that every option, no matter how small, had been tried before the end. That was what she told herself. And then, 6 minutes and 14 seconds after the transmission was sent, the Council communication board lit up. Someone had answered. The reply was short. It was clean. It was in perfectly translated Velhari Standard, which was already strange because no human was supposed to know Velhari Standard at that level of accuracy. But stranger than the translation was the message itself. Not a greeting, not an expression of sympathy, not a long series of questions about the situation. Just one line. "How many are coming?" Riva read it 3 times. Then she looked at Bane. Bane was staring at the screen with an expression she had never seen on his face before in 60 years of sitting beside him on the council. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was the expression of a man who had just seen something he did not have a category for. Outside, the bruised purple sky sat heavy over Velhari Prime. In the shelters below the city, 700 million people were still waiting. They did not know it yet, but something had just changed. Aliens mistakenly thought they had no one left, called humanity for help, and a fleet arrived. Part 2. Old Scars, New Orders. The bunker beneath Sol was not a glamorous place. It had been built 40 years ago, during a time when the governments of Earth had started taking the idea of alien contact seriously. Not the hopeful, excited kind of contact that people in old movies dreamed about, but the realistic kind. The kind where someone shows up and they are not necessarily friendly. The walls were thick reinforced concrete. The lighting was the flat white kind that made everyone look tired. The air always smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and old coffee. There were no windows. There was no natural light. There was just work and the people doing it, and the understanding that the work mattered. Admiral Kang had spent a large part of his career in this bunker. He knew every hallway. He knew which coffee machine on the 3rd level actually worked, and which one just made noise. He knew the names of the night shift security staff and their children's ages. He had celebrated 2 New Years here, 1 birthday and 1 wedding anniversary via video call, because he could not leave. He was a tall man, not young anymore, with close-cut gray hair, and the kind of face that did not move very much when he was thinking. People who did not know him sometimes mistook this for coldness. People who knew him understood it was the opposite. He felt things deeply, which was exactly why he had learned to keep his face still. A man in his position could not afford to let every feeling show. Too many people were watching. Too many people needed to see someone steady. He was standing at the main briefing table when the Velhari transmission finished decoding. Commander Yuna stood to his left. She was younger than Kang by about 15 years, with sharp eyes and the particular kind of stillness that came from someone who had trained for decades to stay calm in rooms where other people were not calm. She commanded the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, which was currently docked in lunar orbit. 260 warships in various states of readiness, crews on rotating standby, waiting for orders that everyone hoped would never come, and everyone suspected would eventually come anyway. Chief Strategist Dohun was seated at the far end of the table, with 3 screens open in front of him. He was not a military man in the traditional sense. He had never commanded a ship, never led soldiers into a field. What he did instead was think. He read data, built models, ran projections, and told people what was most likely to happen before it happened. He had been wrong before, but not often, and when he was wrong, he figured out why he was wrong and made sure it did not happen again. The fleet called him the calculator behind his back. He was aware of this and did not mind. The 3 of them read the transmission in silence. Kang read it once fast, then again slowly. He looked at the casualty figures. 41 worlds, 40 billion dead, 6 years of war. He looked at the swarm composition data, the numbers, the ship types, the recorded behaviors, the tactical patterns. He looked at the map showing how far the swarm had already spread, and the projected path of advance if nothing stopped it. He set the report down. He did not say anything for almost a full minute. Yuna and Dohun waited. They had both been in enough rooms with Kang to know that interrupting his silence was not a useful thing to do. Finally he spoke. How long to get every ship off dock? Yuna answered immediately. 12 hours for the 3rd Fleet. If we pull the 1st and 2nd from their patrol routes, and the reserve ships from the Mars yards, add another 8. 20 hours total, roughly. Make it 12, Kang said. The 3rd Fleet moves first. We request the others en route. Yuna nodded. She had already started mentally running through the call list in her head. Captains to contact. Supply manifest to check. Fuel loads to confirm. She was the kind of person who started solving the problem before the order was fully given. Dohun looked up from his screens. The swarm's projected arrival at Velhari Prime, he said, his voice flat and precise, is between 18 and 22 days from now, based on their current movement rate. Travel time to the Velhari system at standard fold speed, that gives us a window of 2 to 6 days on site before the main assault, assuming our travel estimate is correct and their advance does not accelerate. Is it enough time? Kang asked. Dohun considered this in the way he considered everything, quickly, thoroughly, without pretending to be more certain than he was. It depends on what we find when we get there. If the Velhari defensive grid is still partially functional, yes. If it has already collapsed, we will need to work with what we bring. He paused. The swarm's tactical data in this transmission is detailed. They have not fought anything like our fleet configuration before. That is an advantage. Advantages can be wasted. They will not be wasted, Kang said simply. He picked up the transmission report again and looked at the last line. The one that was not in formal diplomatic language. The one that said, "We have no one left." If there is anyone listening, please come. He had read a lot of distress calls in his career. Most of them were formatted correctly, full of proper codes and protocol language and official request numbers. This one was not like that. This one felt like what it actually was. Someone at the end of everything, reaching out because they had nothing else left to reach for. He thought about what that felt like. He thought about the people in those shelters on Valhari Prime, waiting without knowing if anything would answer. Then he set the report down one final time and looked at Yuna. "Tell the captains to brief their crews personally," he said. "Not over the ship intercom. In person. They need to hear it from a face, not a speaker." Yuna understood what he meant. This was not a training exercise. This was not a patrol. This was something the fleet had prepared for in theory, for a long time, without quite believing it would actually happen. The crews needed to understand what they were going toward. They needed to hear it clearly, and have a moment to hold it before the work began. "Understood," she said, and left the room at a pace that was just below a run. Dohun was already closing his screens and moving to the door. "I will have tactical projections ready before we reach fold coordinates," he said, without turning around. "And Kang." He stopped. He turned slightly, just enough to be heard clearly. "The transmission they sent us. Their casualty figures are accurate. I have cross-referenced them against 3 independent sensor databases. They did not exaggerate." He paused. "Whoever these people are, they have been fighting this alone for a very long time." He left without waiting for a response. Kang stood alone in the bunker briefing room for a moment. The screens around him still showed the Valhari data. The red marks, the swarm formations, the casualty numbers, the path of destruction cutting through the galaxy like a scar. He thought about scars. He thought about the fact that Earth had its own history of them. His own people had known what it was to be overwhelmed, to be outnumbered, to lose more than they thought they could survive losing, and then get up and keep going anyway. That was not a special human trait, he supposed. Most species that survived long enough developed it. But humans had practiced it a great deal. They had a lot of experience with it. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked out of the briefing room. 20 floors above him, Seoul was going about its morning. People were getting on trains and eating breakfast and arguing about ordinary things. They did not know yet. They would know soon. Not everything, not the parts that would cause panic, but enough to understand that their fleet was leaving, and that the reason mattered. Kang walked toward the elevator and began preparing what he would say to them. Continued in Part 3. Aliens mistakenly thought they had no one left, called humanity for help, and a fleet arrived. Part 3. What humanity had been doing. The UEDF Indomitable was not a pretty ship. It was not designed to be. It was designed to take damage and keep moving. Its hull was layered, thick outer plates of composite armor, over a secondary shell of reactive material that hardened on impact. And beneath that, a third internal frame built to stay intact, even if the first 2 were destroyed. It was wide and heavy, and moved through space with the kind of slow, deliberate purpose of something that was not afraid of what was in front of it. There were ships in the fleet that were faster. There were ships that were more elegant. There were none that were harder to kill. Fleet engineer Rika had worked on the Indomitable for 6 years. She knew the ship the way some people know a house they grew up in. Not just the rooms and the hallways, but the small things. The way a specific panel on Deck 4 hummed slightly when the power load shifted. The way the mass driver array on the port side needed half a degree of manual correction because the automated calibration system had a small, consistent error that nobody had ever fully fixed. The way the engine room smelled different in the first hour after a full restart versus a partial one. She was in the main weapons bay running diagnostics when the order came through. She heard it over the ship intercom first, not the details, just the word that the captain wanted all senior crew in the main briefing room in 20 minutes. Then she heard the tone in the announcement officer's voice. It was not the careful, practiced tone of routine communication. There was something underneath it. Something more like the sound of a person who has just understood that something real is happening. Rika finished the diagnostic she was running, saved her data, and went to the briefing room. Captain Taesung was already there when she arrived. He was a compact man with a quiet voice, and the habit of looking directly at whoever he was speaking to, in a way that made it clear he expected them to do the same. He had commanded the Indomitable for 4 years. He was not the kind of captain who gave speeches often. When he spoke, people listened, partly because he spoke well, and partly because he did not waste words on things that did not need saying. He told them clearly and without dramatization. There was an alien species called the Velhari. They had been fighting a war for 6 years against something called the Drat Swarm. They had lost that war, effectively. Every ally they had was gone. They had sent a distress call to Earth as a last attempt. The fleet was responding. They would fold to the Velhari system in 16 days. They would engage the swarm. They would do their best to stop it. He paused after saying that, and looked around the room. "I know some of you have questions," he said. "Ask them." There were questions. Rika listened to them, and listened to Taesung's answers. He did not pretend to know things he did not know. He said the swarm was large. He said Earth Command believed the fleet had a tactical advantage, because the swarm had not fought human ships before. He said the casualty projections were serious, and everyone needed to understand that before they left. He said that if anyone had personal matters that needed to be handled in the next 12 hours, handle them now, because once they folded, there would not be another opportunity for a while. After the briefing ended, Rika went back to the weapons bay. She did not think about fear yet. She thought about work, because work was what she was good at, and because the mass driver array still needed its port-side calibration corrected before they reached combat range. She pulled up her tools and started on it, moving through the familiar steps, the way someone moves through something they have done enough times that the hands know what to do without being told. While she worked, she thought about something her father had told her when she was young. He had been a structural engineer, not a military man, but he had said something once that had stayed with her. He had said that the most important things humans ever built were not built because they were easy. They were built because somebody sat down with the problem and decided to stay with it until it was solved. But Rika had always thought it applied to most things. She thought about that while she corrected the calibration and moved on to the next system check. What the Velhari did not know, what almost no species outside of Earth's own records understood, was how long humanity had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Not because they had been warned it was coming, not because they had any specific intelligence about the swarm or any other external threat, but because humans remembered their own history. They remembered what it had cost them, over centuries, to not be ready. They had learned that lesson in the most painful ways possible, multiple times, and they had decided at some point as a species that they were not going to learn it again. The first United Earth Defense Force ships had been built nearly 80 years ago. Back then they were small, limited things, fast patrol vessels mostly, designed for observation and response to near-Earth threats. But the program had not stayed small. Year by year, funding had grown. Technology had developed. New ship classes had been designed, tested, refined, and put into service. The fleet that now sat in lunar orbit was not the fleet of 80 years ago. It was the result of 8 decades of accumulated work. 8 decades of engineers like Rika running diagnostics and finding problems and fixing them. 8 decades of strategists like Dohun running projections and updating plans. 8 decades of officers like Taesung learning their ships until they knew them the way Rika knew the Indomitable. 260 warships. More than 90,000 crew across the full fleet. weapon systems that had been tested in field conditions and refined based on what had been learned, armor configurations that had been redesigned 4 times based on projected threat scenarios, medical systems, supply chains, communication networks, fold navigation technology that had been developed independently of any alien assistance, because humanity had decided early on not to be dependent on outside help for something as critical as getting where they needed to go. No alien species had studied any of this closely. Why would they? Earth was a small planet on the quiet edge of the galaxy. The humans were young. They had not been involved in any major conflict in the interstellar community. There was no obvious reason to look at them carefully. That was, in retrospect, a significant oversight. On the Indomitable's observation deck, a young weapons officer named Sue stood watching as the fleet assembled in lunar orbit. She had never seen all of them together before. In training, in patrol assignments, in exercises, she had always seen portions of the fleet, a dozen ships, maybe 20. Seeing them all at once was different. They filled the space around the moon in slow, organized formation, moving into departure alignment with a precision that came from long practice. Carrier groups, destroyer screens, siege platforms, the massive supply ships that would keep the fleet operational for months without resupply. All of it moving together like something that had been built for exactly this purpose, because it had been. She stood there for a long time, watching them. Then she went back to her station, because there was work to do. 16 days. They had 16 days to travel, to prepare, to make sure every system was ready and every crew member knew their role. Dohan's projections said they would arrive with 2 to 6 days before the swarm's main assault. That was not a lot of time. But it was time, and time was what humans had always been very good at using. On the bridge of the Indomitable, Taesung looked at the departure clock counting down on the main screen. Around him, his crew moved quietly through their pre-fold procedures, each person focused, each person doing exactly what they had trained to do. He thought about the Velhari. He thought about what it must have been like to watch 41 worlds fall and know that every ally you had was gone. He thought about the person who had written that last line, "We have no one left," and what it had taken to write that after 6 years of fighting. He thought that it must have taken a great deal. The departure clock reached 0. The fleet folded. Continued in Part 4. Aliens mistakenly thought they had no one left, called humanity for help, and a fleet arrived. Part 4. The fleet arrives. The Velhari sensor operator on duty when the fold signatures appeared was a young technician named Pell. Pell had been working the night monitoring shift for 3 weeks, which was the kind of job nobody wanted. Long, quiet, full of the particular anxiety of watching for something terrible and being unable to do anything about it when it came. He had watched the swarm's advance markers on his screen every night. He had watched the outer system relay buoys go dark one by one as the swarm's advance scouts moved closer. He had filed his reports and gone home to sleep badly and come back and done it again. On this night, his screen showed something new. The signatures were brief at first, small distortions at the edge of the system's sensor range, the kind of reading that showed up occasionally from background stellar activity and usually resolved into nothing. But these did not resolve into nothing. They grew, they multiplied, they spread across the sensor grid in a way that made no physical sense for any natural phenomenon Pell had ever been trained to recognize. He stared at his screen for about 4 seconds. Then he hit the alert. Elder Riva was not asleep when the alarm reached her. She had stopped sleeping well several months ago and had essentially stopped trying at this point. She was in her office on the upper level of the council complex, reading, or trying to read, a damage assessment from the northern continent's atmospheric processors. When the priority signal came through on her terminal, she opened it immediately. The message from the monitoring station was short. Unidentified fold signatures detected at outer system boundary. Count rising. Nature unknown. All available sensors being directed to the area. Riva stood up and went to the command center. By the time she arrived, the main screen was showing the outer system sensor feed. The fold signatures had stopped being vague distortions. They were resolving now. Solid contacts, one after another, like lights being switched on in a dark room. The count in the corner of the screen was climbing. 10, 20, 40, 80. Nobody in the command center was speaking. They were all watching the number climb. Counselor Bane came in behind Riva. He looked at the screen. He looked at the count. He looked at Riva. Neither of them said anything. The count passed 100. One of the younger operators made a small sound, not a word, just an involuntary breath, the kind that escapes when something happens that a person is not prepared for. The count kept climbing. At 140, the first visual imaging came through, grainy long-range optical sensor data showing the actual shapes of the ships. They were not Velhari. They were not Swarm. They were something else entirely. Wide, heavily armored, built with the kind of blunt, functional mass that spoke of engineering choices prioritizing durability over appearance. They moved in formation, organized into groups, each group maintaining a precise position relative to the others. The formation as a whole was shaped in a pattern that Riva recognized from her military history studies as a classic envelopment approach, designed not just to advance, but to surround, to cut off retreat, to ensure that whatever was being engaged had nowhere to go. The count reached 260 and stopped climbing. 260 warships, all of them coming in at fold exit velocity, already decelerating into combat approach speed, already orienting toward the inner system where Velhari Prime sat under its bruised and damaged sky. Riva's communication officer turned for this station with wide eyes. "We have an incoming signal," he said, "directed at us. They are using our own encryption standard." "Put it through," Riva said. The voice that came through the speaker was calm. Not the careful, practiced calm of a diplomat choosing their words. The easy, natural calm of someone who was doing something they had trained for and had a job to do and was focused on doing it. A man's voice, steady and clear. "Velhari Command, this is UEDF First Armada. Captain Taesong speaking on behalf of Admiral Kang. We have received your transmission, and we are here. Please identify your priority targets and current defensive status. We would like to begin coordination immediately." The command center was silent. Riva looked at Bane. Bane was looking at the screen where the count still showed 260. His face had the expression she had seen when the reply first came in. The expression of someone encountering something they had no category for. Then Riva stepped forward and picked up the communication link. "Captain Taesong," she said, "we are glad you are here. The Swarm's main assault force is currently staging at the outer system boundary, approximately 9 light hours from our position. Advance elements are already inside the system. Our defensive grid has sustained significant damage. We estimate 40% functionality. Our remaining fleet consists of—" She paused and made herself say the number clearly, because there was no point now in soft language. 11 ships, all damaged. A brief pause from the other end. "Understood. Hold your current position and keep your grid running at whatever capacity you have. We will handle the advance elements first. Expect communications updates every 30 minutes. That was all. The channel shifted to tactical coordination frequency, and the human fleet began to move. Pell, still at his monitoring station, watched his sensor screen as the 260 ships reconfigured from approach formation into something he had never seen before. They broke into 5 groups with practice speed. 2 groups moved outward, sweeping wide arcs around the system's plane to cut off the swarm's flanking approach routes. A 3rd group moved directly toward the advanced swarm elements, already inside the system. The scouts and light assault ships that had been probing Velhari defenses for the past week. The fourth group held a central position, clearly a reserve force or command element. The fifth moved close to Velhari Prime, positioning between the planet and the most likely direct assault corridor. The advanced swarm elements detected the fleet. Pell watched the swarm's movement patterns on his screen. They were used to being the largest thing in any engagement. They were used to spreading outward, overwhelming, swarming their targets with numbers and speed and relentless pressure. They had done it 41 times on 41 worlds, and it had worked every time. They spread now the way they always did, moving toward the human ships with the confidence of something that had never been stopped. The third human group, 40 ships, met them head-on. What happened next was very fast and very loud over the communication frequencies. The mass driver arrays opened fire first. The range was extreme, farther than most conventional weapons were effective. The swarm ships were not built to deal with mass driver fire at that range, because no species they had fought before used mass drivers at that range. The first volley took out 9 advanced scouts before the swarm had closed to their own effective firing distance. The second volley took out 14 more. The swarm closed anyway. They were not a species that retreated from numbers. They pressed forward, firing their own weapons as they came. Energy weapons, the kind that had cut through Velhari shields like they were not there. The human shields held. They did not hold cleanly. 3 ships took damage, one of them serious, but they held long enough for the third human group to shift to close-range weapons and complete the engagement. The swarm advance element ceased to exist in approximately 11 minutes. Riva stood in the command center and watched the sensor feed. The red markers representing the swarm advance units had simply stopped moving. The human fleet had already reformed, already moving toward the next objective, already on the communication channel giving Velhari Command a clean brief update on the engagement result and requesting confirmation of the next priority target. She had not heard the word casualties yet from their side. She did not know if that was because there were none, or because they were handling it, and it was not the priority right now. She thought about the 11 Velhari ships sitting at Velhari Prime, battered, low on power reserves, crewed by people who had been fighting for 6 years, and had essentially made peace with the idea that they were going to lose. She thought about what those crews were seeing on their own sensor feeds right now. She hoped it was doing something to them. She hoped it was giving them back something they had put away. The bruised purple sky outside was lightening slightly. The atmospheric processors on the eastern grid were slowly coming back online, as the engineering teams that had been too stretched for months suddenly had one less emergency to respond to. Bane appeared beside her. He was looking at the screen where the human fleet was visible in formation, clean and precise and moving like it had somewhere to be. It was a simple thing to say. He said it simply. Yes, Riva said. Continued in Part 5. Aliens mistakenly thought they had no one left, called humanity for help, and a fleet arrived. Part 5. They called for help. Help answered. The battle lasted 19 hours and 23 minutes. Riva knew the exact number, because she did not leave the command center for any of it. She watched the whole thing on the sensor feeds, not because there was anything useful she could contribute by watching, but because she was the head of the Velhari Council, and these were her people's lives, and she was not going to look away. It was not a clean battle. Clean battles existed in old stories and training simulations. Real ones were different. Real ones had moments of things going wrong, moments of unexpected problems, moments where the plan collided with reality, and everyone had to adapt fast, or pay for it. The Drat Swarm's main assault force arrived earlier than Dohan's projections had suggested. Not by much, but enough. The outer system position 2 human groups had taken was not yet fully consolidated when the first swarm wave came through. The 2 groups held, but one of them, the one positioned on the system's northern arc, took serious fire in the first 40 minutes. Several ships in that group sustained heavy damage. Two were pulled back to the fourth group's position for emergency repairs. The remaining ships closed their gaps and held the line with fewer ships than originally planned. It was the kind of pressure that broke most formations. The human fleet compressed, adjusted, and kept fighting. Rika spent most of the battle in the Indomitable's lower engineering deck, which had taken a hit in the third hour of the engagement. A burst conduit had started a contained fire in the secondary power routing room, and the automatic suppression system had not fully engaged. She and two other engineers put it out manually, rerouted the affected systems to backup feeds, restored 70% functionality to the portside weapons array within 12 minutes, and then immediately moved to the next problem, because there was one. There was always a next problem in a battle. That was what battles were. She did not think about anything large during those hours. She thought only about what was directly in front of her. The conduit, the reroute, the calibration readout, the next system that needed checking. One thing at a time, moving through the ship the way she always moved through the ship. With the hands-on, problem-forward attention of someone who loved the work and understood that the work mattered. The Indomitable took 3 more hits over the course of the battle. It stayed in the fight for all 19 hours. On the bridge, Taesung managed the ship and his crew with the same quiet precision that had characterized everything he did. He did not shout, he did not give dramatic speeches over the intercom. When things went wrong, he identified the problem, made a decision, and communicated it clearly. When crew members did something well, he noted it briefly and moved on. He kept his voice at a consistent level throughout the entire engagement, not because he did not feel the pressure of what was happening, but because he understood that the sound of his voice was a signal to every person on the bridge. If it stayed level, they stayed level. If it broke, something would fracture in the room that would be hard to put back. His voice stayed level. The turning point came in the 14th hour. The swarm had been pressing the central formation with its heaviest ships, enormous things, far larger than anything in the human fleet, built to absorb fire and return it in overwhelming amounts. They had been doing this in rotating waves, cycling fresh heavy units forward as the ones in front became damaged. It was a tactic that had worked against the Velhari fleet repeatedly. It worked by exhausting the defenders. It worked by making the cost of holding position too high to sustain. It did not work here for one reason that the swarm had not anticipated. The fourth human group, the one that had been held in reserve, had been doing something for the past 8 hours. While the outer groups fought and the central formation held under pressure, the reserve group had been circling wide, moving in a long, slow arc around the engagement zone, staying just outside the swarm's active sensor focus. The swarm was not designed to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. Every species they had fought before had eventually concentrated their remaining forces into one defensive position, which was the rational thing to do when you were being overwhelmed. The humans had not done the rational thing. They had sent 40 ships on an 8-hour detour to hit the swarm's heavy assault group from directly behind, while it was forward committed to the frontal engagement. The result was not instant, but it was decisive. The heavy assault group, hit from 2 directions at once and unable to disengage cleanly without exposing its most vulnerable rear sections, lost cohesion within 3 hours. The swarm attempted to consolidate its remaining forces and reform. The human fleet did not give it enough time. At hour 19, the swarm broke. It was not a total destruction. The swarm lost approximately 60% of the assault force, with the rest folding out of the system in retreat. It was the first organized retreat in the Drat swarm's recorded history of expansion. Every species that had ever studied the swarm had noted in their records that the swarm did not retreat. It did not retreat because it had never encountered a situation where retreat was the more survivable option. It had encountered that situation now. When the last swarm ship folded out of the system, the Velhari command center was silent for a long moment. Then someone started speaking. Then someone else. Within a minute, the room was loud, in a way that rooms full of people are loud when something they did not fully believe could happen has just happened in front of them. Riva stood in the middle of it and did not make noise. She felt something, certainly. She would feel more of it later, in private, when she had time to let it settle. But right now, she was still the head of the council, and there was still work to do. The fleet needed to be assessed. The damage to Valhari Prime needed to be evaluated. The outer system relay network needed to be checked, and the question of what the swarm's retreat meant for its next move needed to be answered by people who understood military strategy better than she did. She contacted the human fleet on the tactical channel. Taesung answered. His voice sounded the same as it had at the beginning of the engagement. Level, clear, slightly tired, in the way a person is tired after 19 hours of sustained focus. Elder Riva, the system is clear. We are doing a full damage assessment now. We have casualties. I will have accurate numbers for you within the hour. Is Valhari Prime secure? Yes, Riva said. Thanks to you. A brief pause. I will pass that along to the Admiral. He will want to speak with your council when you are ready. 3 days later, Riva met Admiral Kang in person for the first time. He came aboard the Valhari Council orbital station in a small shuttle with a 4-person escort. He was taller than she had expected, from the brief glimpses she had gotten on communication screens. He wore his uniform plainly, no decorations except his rank insignia. Commander Yuna was with him, and Dohan, who had already been in 2 days of continuous communication with Valhari military analysts, and looked like he had not slept, which he had not. Riva had prepared a formal reception. She had done it because it was protocol, and because these people deserved acknowledgement. Kang accepted it politely, and moved through it with the patience of a man who understood that ceremony served a purpose, but was waiting for the conversation afterward. The conversation happened in a small briefing room. Just Riva, Bane, Kang, and Yuna. Dohan had gone directly to a working session with the Valhari defense analysts, and was probably already 2 hours deep into whatever problem he had decided to solve next. Kang sat across the table from Riva. He held a cup of something warm. One of his people had brought their own coffee supply, which Riva found both practical and endearing. He looked at her with the direct, steady attention she had heard he gave to everyone. "You have questions," he said. It was not really a question. "One," Riva said. "Why did you come? We are not your people. We are barely your allies. We had never even formally established contact before the transmission. You had no obligation. You could have decided the situation was not your problem." Kang was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cup in his hands, then back at her. "You asked," he said. Riva waited for more. There was no more. That was the complete answer. Bane was looking at Kang, with the expression, the third time she had seen it now, of a man encountering something he did not have a category for. "That was enough?" she said. "Yes," Kang said. "That was enough." She thought about that for a long time after he left. She thought about 41 worlds that had called for help and received nothing. She thought about the years of fighting alone, of watching allies fall, of sending signals into silence. She thought about one small blue planet on the quiet edge of the galaxy that had answered in 6 minutes and arrived in 16 days, with 260 ships. She went back to the council chamber that evening. The star map was still there above the table, still full of red marks, still carrying all the loss of the past 6 years. But the Valhari system was no longer blinking yellow. It was still standing. She pulled up the records archive and went to the section where allied species were catalogued. She scrolled past it. She went to the section where protected species were listed. She scrolled past that too. She created a new section. She did not have a name for it immediately, so she sat with it for a while and thought about the right words. Not allies, because that word implied a formal arrangement built on mutual benefit. Not protectors, because that word made the relationship sound like charity. Finally, she typed 2 words. Those who come when called. She entered humanity under it. Then she closed the archive, stood up from the table, and walked to the window. Outside, the sky over Velhari Prime was clear, and its normal color, for the first time in months. The atmospheric processors were back online. Below the city, the shelters were opening. People were coming up into the light. They did not know the full story yet. They would learn about the fleet that had come from the edge of the galaxy, about the people who had spent 80 years preparing for a fight that was not even theirs to fight, about the admiral who had given the order to leave in 12 hours without hesitation, about the engineer who had fixed a burst conduit in the middle of a battle and kept her ship running, about the captain who had kept his voice level for 19 hours so that everyone around him could stay level too. They would learn all of it, and perhaps most importantly, they would learn the answer to the question Riva had asked in that small briefing room. The answer that had stopped her completely. The answer that was, in its own way, the most extraordinary thing about all of it.